I'm Sharyl Attkisson. Here's Bella Shaw with what's next on Showbiz Today.
As an investigative reporter at CBS, I was on the leading edge of discovering a big shift in trends, conflicts of interest, the editorial issues, the lack of honesty. I was told things like, this story is so good, we're going to save it for next week. Maybe tomorrow we have breaking news that has to air today, and at some point you can tell the story's never going to air.
Now you leave to go independent in 14. Did you ever think that those same pressures would be exerted on social media?
Social media was given likewise to the advertisers and the political interests. They're designing an artificial environment to make it appear as though everybody agrees about something that's not necessarily the case, so that everybody else who doesn't agree maybe shuts their mouth or feels like they can't speak about it. And if they continue to speak about it, then they may be censored or excluded from the conversation.
Then we all of a sudden have this COVID event, which kind of maybe dials it up significantly.
It became so audacious and so in your face to logical thinking people on all sides of the political spectrum that things that were happening weren't rational. Fact checks or rational questions were being asked that were being then censored or discredited as debunked when they weren't. Ordinary people saw this and their health was at stake.
You always want more discussion. I really believe the best idea always wins.
Well, that's the tell. When something is censored, it probably deserves greater attention by the public because there's a very strong likelihood that some of that information at least is true, if they've bothered to censor it. The question that you should ask yourself, who wants that censored and why? So I think our main job is to make sure people are skeptical of what they hear and find out other ways to get information besides the monopolized sources so that they can reach truth.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
Hey, I know investing in crypto is scary. It takes a real leap of faith because there are so many scams, rug pulls, and bad actors out there. It's a dangerous business, which is why 95% of people lose all their money. Well, that's why I created the London Real Investment Club, so you can access the hottest deals on the planet and use the crypto bull market to create the generational wealth that you deserve. Join my team of over 100 people from around the world that are making millions of dollars behind the scenes investing in blockchain, AI, Web3 games, DeFi, Bitcoin, and more. Don't miss out. Click the link below to book a call with one of my team now. But hurry, this bull market will end soon.
I know investing in crypto can be scary. That's why you gotta join the investment club. Pull the trigger. Let's do this.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Sharyl Attkisson, the investigative journalist, news reporter, and author. You spent over 30 years working as a news correspondent and anchor for PBS, CBS, and CNN, winning 5 Emmys and the Edward R. Murrow Award for investigative reporting. You are also the New York Times bestselling author of the books Slanted, The Smear, and Stonewalled. Your latest book, Follow the Science: How Big Pharma Misleads, Obscures, and Prevails, exposes the corruption that has ruled the pharmaceutical industry and mainstream news media for decades. Your weekly show, Full Measure with Sharyl Attkisson, reaches over 43 million U.S. households and focuses on the real stories behind the headlines. You describe yourself as nonpartisan, dedicated to factual accuracy, and believe that now more than ever, it is vital to support independent journalism and uphold integrity in an age of pervasive censorship and media distrust. Sharyl, welcome to London Real.
Well, thank you. You got it all down there.
There you go. It's quite a CV, as we say here in Britain. You're very interesting to me because you used to be in the mainstream and now you're really independent. And I don't talk to many people that have seen both sides and experienced maybe the ups and downs of both sides. You left, I think, CBS in 2014, so that was 10 years ago. What can you tell people about the difference between those two worlds? I think back in 14, nobody had any idea that maybe the mainstream media wasn't 100% factual. I might argue that in the last 4 years, some people might believe that, but I would still say a lot of people, including people in this country, they turn on the BBC and it is gospel, especially if you're over 50. It just is. Tell me, what was it like on both sides, and what can you tell people about that mainstream?
Well, I think as an investigative reporter at CBS, I was on the leading edge of discovering a big shift in trends in mainstream media. The shift in trends had to do, I've written books that you named on all of this stuff, there's a lot that goes into it, but had to do with it becoming the animal that it is today from what we thought of the news media for many decades as being. And I think I noticed the conflicts of interest, the editorial issues, the lack of honesty, maybe ahead of everybody else, although my colleagues were complaining about the same things. But as an investigative reporter, my work tended to be work that saw the most impact from this editorial interference early on. And I think I got out at a great time. When I left CBS, I quit ahead of my contract because I had tried to operate in this, I felt like it was a dishonest environment for a couple of years. Had a great career for many, many years at CBS, but there were key figures inside the network that started to have editorial control over matters that they shouldn't in inappropriate ways, dishonest ways. And this was happening at the other networks too. So I thought I was going to get out of the business. You know, I'm leaving CBS. Who's going to hire me? I'm speaking out about what's wrong with the industry. And then this independent opportunity came up. I didn't really want to jump into another job, but within a year I was ready to take on this weekly show. And I've enjoyed a great deal of independence that I used to have at CBS and CNN and PBS. In fact, my colleagues, when they see what we report on Full Measure, I often hear, how do they let you report that? And it's just ordinary reporting, you know, factual reporting and in-depth reporting on issues that everybody would have done 15, 20 years ago that people aren't doing anymore. And my answer is they allow us to do it here. They don't have that top-down editorial interference. So the difference is drastic and in a good way. And I don't think I've experienced any downsides I can think of offhand about being on an independent show.
Did you feel that coming on? Like if you go back to like 94, 2004, up to 2014, did it slowly become more and more pervasive, that control? And do you think that correlated with, you know, advertising dollars or specific companies with advertising dollars on the network?
Yes, it started to bleed in the early 2000s. The first impact I noticed was with the pharmaceutical industry interfering in the news industry. I later learned, only with the benefit of hindsight, that the media outlets in America were lobbying side by side with the pharmaceutical industry, lobbying Congress to make direct-to-consumer ads more common and acceptable. This is prescription drug advertising on TV. A lot of people watching may not remember or know it was illegal in the US, as it is in most every other country, until a certain time period. And once it became where the drug companies were able to sponsor newscasts and buy network television programming and so on, I think that was sort of the key moment where we began to change, and they were invited to have undue influence on our reporting. At the time, all the networks and the major publications were reporting on prescription drug dangers and inappropriate things. That almost came to a halt. And again, looking back, I can see the timeline, which is clear, but when I was in the middle of it, I was being assigned to cover these stories on the one hand, and at some point I began feeling pressure only from certain corners of the network to not do those stories, while I was encouraged by my direct supervisors to do them. So it was sort of a confusing time. Looking back, I now see what was happening in the timeline with the financial conflicts.
It's interesting because if you run a big organization like that, you must have to kind of massage it, because you can't come tell your editors that they can't cover the news, because then your editors will revolt, right? Proper news people won't be told what to do. So they probably had to find ways of discouraging it, trying to get you to not do those things. And that must have been a weird, conflicted organization.
You portray it very accurately. I was never told that the stories weren't awesome. I broke a lot of news, like that Viagra can cause blindness. That was one big international story that I broke. Or stories about the dangers of statin drug, cholesterol-lowering drugs that were being hidden by the drug makers and so on. But the stories were always got a lot of accolades in terms of industry recognition, and my direct supervisors who asked for the stories and appreciated when I would break these stories. But yes, there came a point in time when I would start to feel what I call the big chill. And it's hard to describe because, again, no one ever said the stories weren't terrific. They said quite the opposite. But it came to be toward the end of my time there, the last couple of years, a lot of stories still aired, but many stories, I would say more good stories, were left on the cutting room floor, as they say. And it was never because they weren't good. They were approved by our legal department and all the people up the chain. But I was told things like, this story is so good, we're going to save it for next week. And then next week would come, and it's like, maybe tomorrow we have breaking news that has to air today. And I called it death by 1,000 cuts. I could tell the story was, at some point you can tell the story's never going to air. And they're never going to say why. They're going to just tell you it's such a great story, but it never airs.
Wow. And then are you also not getting promoted, or you weren't even thinking about promoted, you just wanted to keep doing the work? Or were they slowing your career trajectory a little too in that chill?
In terms of my career goals, I think I was at the pinnacle. I was the investigative reporter for CBS News. I think at some point the only one they had doing full-time investigative reporting. Loved that job. It was just a plumb awesome job. Spent almost my full time doing that. So I was where I wanted to be. I was getting big contracts and salary increases. So on the one hand, I was encouraged or being encouraged. And then on the other hand, I would feel this big chill with a lot of my stories that were very important, I felt, not making air, and that was discouraging. I mean, to convince a whistleblower on a very important issue who works, for example, inside a federal agency, to tell a story that's probably going to destroy his career and to some extent his personal life, and then when the story doesn't air, to have to go back to that person and say nobody cares after all, it's just, it chips away at your heart, to have to do that time and time again. And I didn't feel like I could just keep doing it.
Wow. Well, we look back in history at the moment when we allowed these advertisements on mainstream television as one of the worst moments in human history, that it empowered so many bad things to happen. And when did that actually happen? What was the year that kind of turned on?
I'd say around the 2004-2005 time period. And I'm not sure the advertising in itself is at fault. It's the failure on our part as an industry to create a firewall on the front end where it couldn't interfere. I always argued if we were to go back to these advertising interests, and in some cases political interests, that try to influence our reporting, and instead of when they call responding to them, if we had a policy where we were to say, we can't talk to you about this. If you have a complaint, put it in writing and there's a process to follow, but we can't engage with you in this kind of push me, pull you over, you'll get an exclusive interview if you don't air this investigation. We should never have engaged in the conversation. And very early on, I go to these investigative seminars and meetings and conferences, and I started saying years ago when I recognized this and that it was happening industry-wide, not just at CBS, I said we need to have sessions on this topic and how to protect ourselves as an industry or we're going to lose our credibility. And the people who were organizing these conferences were apparently not interested and never held this discussion. Interestingly, during the same time period, I went to a journalism conference in Moscow where this stuff was discussed, oddly enough, and was happening around the world similarly as to what was happening in the United States. And they were trying to address this trend, not just advertising trends, but political problems with people, anyone who's going off the establishment narrative, whether it was right or left, journalists suffering personal attacks and career hits and so on. It was addressed in that Moscow journalism conference in a way I never heard it discussed in the United States. And to this day, I don't think it's taken, well, now it's too late. I just feel like those who are influencing us on the outside now have been invited into our newsrooms and they work within the news organizations, and there's really no way to sever those interests anymore.
Wow. I worked in banking for a long time, and they have something called the Chinese wall in banking. So if you work at Goldman Sachs, You've got the analyst department that decides to cover that stock and to be critical of whether it's a good or bad stock to buy. And then you get the other department that's involved with the CEO and the CFO to help them raise money and sell bonds and sell stock. And there's supposedly a wall where they don't talk to each other and there's no influence. And no one says, hey, can you give them a good review because we're about to... But they're always a little looked upon with suspicion because in the long enough timeline, a lot of times those conflicts, they don't get resolved in the right way.
Yeah.
Do you think that in a long enough timeline that happens as well? Or you think you really could have set up like that Chinese wall equivalent?
There could have been, there just wasn't the desire, because ultimately the interests of the corporation that runs the news division is different than the interest of the news division. And there came a time, since I've been in the news business for 40 plus years, news was not expected to earn a big profit. It was taken on as something that was a public responsibility. Hopefully it made some money, but that was not the primary goal. And it became where news more had to be a money-making venture. And once that happened, there was an expectation on the corporate level that news was not something that they were going to lift up and hold if it didn't make a lot of money. The news had to start catering more to sponsors. So let's say a friend of mine told me in a Today Show meeting for NBC in the morning meeting, there was a discussion by the head of news at the time how to make a fingernail polish that they would promote on the show that was linked to a sponsor that they hoped to get for the Today Show. So they're doing things to cater to sponsors rather than to cover the news. And once you do that, what are your news topics going to be? Well, they're not going to be a lot of things, and your news topics will be a lot of sort of promotional related things. And I think that's where Full Measure, what we try to do is cover the stories that people aren't covering because they're not looking for ground level news anymore. They're covering what other people are wanting them to cover to push a certain agenda or narrative or advertiser or whatnot.
Okay, wow, that's scary. Now that's corporate interests. Did you ever feel the government was coming in to tell people what to do and what not to do when it comes to that media?
Absolutely. So the government has a big role to play in how it lobbies the networks, and I'm sure the print organizations as well. And a lot of it has to do with just pressure. I remember getting calls after I would do stories. I was not a political reporter, but I can see how political interests thought they had political implications because some of this stuff reflected poorly on one government or another. And they would have a lobby effort that would include calling after a story of mine aired. One person from the White House would call the bureau chief in Washington where I worked. Another person would complain to the White House correspondent assigned from CBS News to the White House, because if you make the beat reporter uncomfortable, look, Sheryl's kind of encroaching on your territory, we don't like her reporting, maybe we're not going to play ball with you. And then someone else would call the evening news editorial folks up in New York, and it becomes a drumbeat where the bosses, they don't like getting those calls. Even if my boss once said to me when he called me after a great story, he kind of chuckled and said, oh, so-and-so from the White House called. And I said, well, what was their complaint? And he said, well, nothing really. They just didn't like the story. And I said, I wish you wouldn't take the calls. I wish you would tell them if they have something to complain about, put it in writing. And he said, oh, I kind of do that. But he didn't like getting the calls at night at his house from someone from the White House complaining about a story, even if the story was defensible. So there is that. And then I had 3 network executives when I was at an investigative reporting conference tell me the same thing that I know happens at CBS or was happening, that if they would rerun a story of mine, an investigative report, let's say the White House didn't like, on the morning show, then the morning show would be told by White House folks, you're not going to get the next Michelle Obama interview, and you won't be in line for this or that. And so they were not rerunning my pieces after Evening News would run them. I didn't learn this until later. And again, my answer to that is, if all the networks would say to the White House, well, we don't really care about the Michelle Obama interview, it's not newsy, you should be happy if we want to interview Michelle Obama, but you're putting her out on a topic we didn't ask you for, and we don't care if we're next in line. If they all did that, we would all be on even playing ground and wouldn't have to capitulate to the lobbying that they do, but they play ball. Okay, well, we want the next Michelle Obama interview, so therefore we won't run this story. And once you start letting the advertisers or political interests have the influence and they realize that, there's a whole industry. There are law firms and PR firms who advertise the fact that they can shape news or kill a story on a network.
Wow. That's pretty fascinating. All right, so that's mainstream. Now you leave to go independent in 14, very early, by the way. I mean, there weren't a lot of podcasts then. There wasn't a lot of independent media going on. I mean, we started in 11, and nobody in London ever heard of a podcast. And in America, it was still coming along. Obviously, you were doing not a podcast, but independent media. Did you ever think that those same pressures would be exerted on social media? Because later we kind of saw that happening, I guess, evidenced by the Twitter files. I'm guessing those didn't surprise you because you saw that happening in mainstream media.
And it was starting to happen in social media. Social media was given, likewise to the advertisers and the political interests, an outsized say-so in what the news covered. If the news had early on said just because bots and PR firms who have lots of accounts on Twitter are able to make a topic controversial or trend, doesn't mean that we should pay attention to it as if that's real. But they started paying attention to it as if it's real very early on, which opened the door to a whole industry that shaped social media so that news will be covered a certain way. There's an anecdote with an acquaintance of mine from NBC who was a correspondent who reported on something, and I don't remember it being particularly controversial, some breaking news story, and had to fly on an airplane from the East Coast to the West Coast. And he said, Sharyl, by the time I landed on the West Coast, the president of NBC and the head of all kinds of people in the news division, the legal department, were on a phone call for me because something I had said had gone viral or had been made to go viral on Twitter. And he goes, that got more attention from the network than any reporting I'd ever done on important topics. But they were so worried about this thing that had gone viral on Twitter in the space of a couple of hours. And he was just amazed that, again, social media was given the power to move editorial content on the network like that.
And you think too much power?
Yeah, I think so.
I think it was the illusion of interest, not interest.
Yes, so I think social media is all about, there is of course real sentiment there, but I like to say any method of controlling the public information that can be co-opted has been co-opted. And social media made this very easy way for the powerful interests, as we've seen, I think, to come in and control the beginning of the spigot of the water that comes out. So on the front end, if they can skew and control what people see and think and what they believe is important or that people are talking about and the way that they think people feel, it creates this false impression. You can't speak up about something if you feel differently because, look, everybody feels this way. Well, that's on purpose. They're designing an environment, an artificial environment, to make it appear as though everybody agrees about something that's not necessarily the case, so that everybody else who doesn't agree maybe shuts their mouth or feels like they can't speak about it. And if they continue to speak about it, then they may be censored or excluded from the conversation.
I keep thinking Twitter in my head because it felt like for a long time, this small little, 1 mile square area out of San Francisco was projecting its values to the world and making the world feel weird that you didn't share all of their values. Yeah. And I think Elon calls it the mind virus. Mm-hmm. But it was interesting to see the way he looked at it later. And he said, yeah, there was this small area of downtown that, by the way, is now the zombie apocalypse, but it was projecting all these California values, whatever it was, to the world. And consciously or subconsciously, you did feel a little weird when you weren't agreeing with these things, even if you lived in the middle of, Turkey, or if you lived in all these other places that had their own values. Is that what you think of too? Is that kind of one of the extreme examples of social media?
I think it's a well-studied phenomenon. I think our intelligence agencies use this and have used this strategy when they've tried to influence thought and behavior in foreign countries, and I think they act in some respects also on U.S. soil doing it, that it's very well studied how to shape public opinion, how to make people feel like they are an outlier when they're not, and to exert the kind of pressure that we understand just from psychology and so on makes other people not want to speak out and want to join the club or join the bandwagon, as they say. And I think that's a huge phenomenon on social media. Part of my goal on my social media, I sometimes retweet, I guess Twitter's the one I use the most, controversial things or things that aren't seen as much or things that maybe aren't even necessarily true or opinions that could be off the mainstream. I put that out there on purpose because I think that stuff should circulate. I like to say when the self-proclaimed fact checkers, who usually are there on an assigned mission to make sure certain facts aren't heard, I think people now kind of understand that, but when they're on a mission to hide certain facts, even those which occasionally might not be true, a lot of times they're true facts, But even when they are trying to hide true facts that really aren't true, I, as a journalist, want to access those sometimes. When I do research, that leads me down a trail of information. It doesn't mean I'm reporting the misinformation, but I want to see what people are saying, who's saying it, why it might be. Is there a grain of truth in the misinformation? What's the sentiment behind it? And I resent the fact that when I do a Google search, I can't find the stories and the studies and the information that I'm looking for unless I really figure out clever ways to get around what they're going to show you.
Yeah, it should be a big alarm bell if you can't find something or something's being suppressed. And it is new technology, so it's different than the news that when you covered it, people would watch on a television. Now it's in your pocket, and now it can be created by anyone, anywhere, anytime. And it's a completely different medium. I think Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message. And so now you have people interacting with something 24/7, created by anyone, and you've got a new phenomenon. I've had Mike Benz on the show, who's writing a book, I think, called Weapons of Mass Deletion. And he was explaining to me that in the beginning, the internet was like the perfect weapon for, say, the CIA, because you could put it into all of these countries and you could use it to force your democratic agenda and to put information out to the people that would normally be a harder thing to do. And that worked really well until it started coming back into America. And now it was challenging the American government's narratives. And all of a sudden they realized, we've got a problem here. And I had never really thought of it that way. And here I was, just this totally naive podcaster here in London who quit my job as a banker because I was miserable. And I just started having conversations with my buddies from jiu-jitsu. And then all of a sudden I had conversations with members of parliament, and then, champion boxers, and then activists. And I was just walking along, and I bought this YouTube dream that we're here for creators and we want to support you. And that was all great until 2020, when I got a lesson in government-sponsored censorship. Now, at the time, I didn't realize that probably the government was telling YouTube what to do. And we know, thanks to the Twitter files, that they were telling Twitter what to do. But I was so shocked. It really shook my foundation and everything I believed in. And maybe it's because I'm born in America. Freedom of speech seemed to me to be such a given. And I'd been broadcasting for 9 years, and I'd never had a single piece of content censored until this fateful day when I had a conversation about COVID on April 6th. And then I got introduced to this censorship complex that I still never fully understood till this year. Maybe what was going on. And I still don't know all the details.
Well, the censorship complex, I see, had its beginnings around the 2015 time period. And I actually traced, part of this is the concept of fake news in its modern form. That phrase was invented by a group called First Draft in the 2015 time period. And I called First Draft at the time because it's a nonprofit that had just started at the beginning of the election cycle, when Donald Trump was coming on the scene. And I asked them where they got their funding from, because their charity forms, tax forms hadn't been filed yet. And they acknowledged it was from Google, which is a driver behind a lot of this. I think it's misinformation. They say it's fighting misinformation, but they're putting out their own. And Google at the time was owned by Alphabet, which at the time was run by Eric Schmidt, who was a big Hillary Clinton supporter. So therefore, it suddenly seemed to make sense that all of the fake news that First Draft was flagging was conservative fake news. And because I remember thinking at the time, before I knew the financial ties, why does this website that proclaims itself the arbiter of fake news, and it offers itself as a resource to journalism colleges and journalists around the world who are referring to it, why is there never an example of any liberal media outlets that are putting out fake news? Because certainly there were those. And this all began to make sense. Fairly soon after First Draft came on the scene and introduced the concept of fake news in its modern context, Barack Obama gave a speech at Carnegie Mellon. He was president at the time, and said something like, we have to figure out a way in this wild, wild West media environment to curate the news and to start sorting through it for people. That concept is so familiar to us today, but it was foreign at the time. And when I heard him say that, I was just taken aback as a journalist that someone would be curating news, that the government would be talking about figuring out what news we should and shouldn't see. And I realized since the president was making this speech, it wasn't an offhanded comment. This was something that had been planned and distributed and put out there. From that moment on, you can see the headlines in the New York Times and other papers and the networks picking it up. Fake news this, fake news that. And it was typically in conservative examples, never liberal examples. And then pretty soon, Donald Trump took up the term, a master at marketing. He flipped the phrase into something that benefited him. He started calling the mainstream news media fake news, and I call it a hostile takeover of the term. Now most people attribute that phrase to Donald Trump, but it was not invented by Donald Trump in a modern context. This was a liberal invention during a campaign at the beginning of an election cycle, intended, I believe the evidence shows, to use on behalf of the Hillary Clinton campaign and Democrats in order to censor news. This was the beginning of the curation, the media literacy efforts, these well-funded billionaire foundations that are behind all these efforts to start these resources that we're all supposed to refer to find out what's real. They're actually doing the opposite. You know, I like to say, when a producer said this to me years ago, when a nonprofit or a group is named one thing, it frequently does the opposite of what it says. So when you hear, not in every case, but I would say in most cases, when you hear there's a media literacy group or a fact-checking group, you can suspect it's doing the opposite. It's trying to shape news, keep you from seeing certain facts and so on.
Wow. So you saw all that happening 15, 16, yes. 17, and then you can kind of trace it.
Yes.
Then we all of a sudden have this COVID event, which kind of maybe dials it up significantly because now they're maybe more actively enforcing certain things. How did you see things change then? And then how would you say it's evolved to even today?
Well, I'm not surprised considering the trends that we've discussed that what happened during COVID, but I think it opened the eyes of a lot of people that really weren't seeing it. And in that respect, that's probably a good thing. It became so audacious and so in your face to logical thinking people on all sides of the political spectrum that things that were happening weren't rational, that fact checks or rational questions were being asked that were being then censored or discredited as debunked when they weren't. Ordinary people saw this and their health was at stake. So they started doing some of their own digging and finding resources, as hard as it may be, finding other resources that they could turn to, and then learning in retrospect who was correct. So I think it's been very eye-opening. The disappointing part is, even as it's been revealed that the government was, I think, the major purveyor of misinformation and disinformation, as was the media and the fact-checking groups, nothing's changed. You know, CDC was one of the biggest offenders, and the only thing that's happened, even in the face of promised accountability hearings and so on, is that CDC's budget has been increased. There's been no accountability, no changes in the systems. The media, with the exception of Twitter, is conducting the same censoring and fake fact-checking and fake health fact-checks that they were doing during COVID. So that part's disappointing. One more positive spin-off is, though, a lot of mainstream medical doctors that were esteemed in their field, and I talk about some of these in Follow the Science, that highly published and respected doctors broke away from mainstream medicine when they saw they weren't allowed to treat their patients with viable therapies, or that they were threatened with being fired from their jobs for doing normal medical and advisable medical behavior. They're forming their own coalitions where they're thinking up new answers to solutions that mainstream medicine hasn't even addressed. Our chronic illnesses, why we're dying sooner and becoming sicker, even though we're spending more than ever on healthcare. Everybody's got insurance. Why are we so sick and unhealthy? They're actually looking at root cause problems beyond COVID in a way that I hope and think will benefit society that the ball was dropped on in terms of mainstream medicine and politics.
Wow. And I really want to get into the book. You know, we see now that the big mainstream social media companies, obviously Elon bought X, and it seems that platform has changed significantly. It seems to be more open for free speech. Some people argue about that. Then we see, I guess, Facebook and YouTube maybe unchanged. Yeah. Do you think those will change? Do you think there will ever be real hearings and anybody diving into those organizations? I mean, Trump recently came out and was quite critical of Google because they seem to be not allowing people to search for him and things like that. The Twitter files kind of came and went, were ignored by mainstream media. I don't think anybody was prosecuted. Do you think that will change?
I think instead there may be different platforms born that are outside the sphere of influence, born and created, because a lot of people are trying to do that. I think the reason that the ills and the potential crimes we've seen haven't been punished and there's been no accountability has to do with the corrupt political system in the United States, political media system, whereby there are people in Congress on both sides, and I've spoken to many of them, that want to do real accountability, but they're not permitted to by the party leaders because in all instances, Democrats and Republicans have an organized system under which they rely on the same people in many instances for their financial donations and to get re-election and to stay in power. And even if an interest contributes more to one party than the other, the members will tell you, the members who want to do true accountability, that behind the scenes there's a lot of collusion between Democrats and Republicans, a lot of agreement on maybe they will make a big splash and a fuss by holding a hearing, but nothing will come of it. There will never be a law that passes that does anything meaningful because there is sort of an implicit agreement between them to go hands off of these organizations that they're supposed to oversee and regulate, in large part because they rely on financial support from these very companies. I feel like the committees in Congress that are supposed to oversee, let's say, transportation, the transportation industry, armed services, the defense industry, those members that get on the committees are funded by those industries. That's where they get their donations from. So they end up serving the interests of the very people they're supposed to oversee and make sure there aren't hearings on certain topics. And there isn't legislation unless it reads a particular way. They don't respond to our interests and needs anymore. They're working basically for these special interests. So in this corrupt environment, I don't think there can be accountability. So I do think there will be platforms and different methods of delivering information to us that'll be invented. And I do think a politician as president could make a difference. I don't know if 4 years is enough, but someone who comes in and shakes the tree, a Robert F. Kennedy or a Donald Trump that understands the things that we're talking about and didn't get to where they are by those same money systems as everybody else, they do have the power to come in and maybe change things. But obviously that's difficult with the establishment, press, and social media and everything else being so entrenched in the federal bureaucracy. That's a hard thing to upend in 4 years.
Yeah, it is. So these companies are more powerful than the governments. And also, you don't want to get on their bad side, or you might find that when you search Donald Trump rally, you get a Harris rally coming up. Yeah. And they fund them. And in a lot of these instances you're talking about, they later employ these people sometimes in the industry.
That's right.
It's really scary. But like you said, if anyone could do it, it could be Trump or Bobby who could just go in there and take a look at things. Otherwise, I guess it probably won't change.
But that's why at all costs, the establishment, whoever you want to say they are, cannot have a Trump or a Bobby Kennedy. And that's why I think you see the kind of shenanigans that we see going on now to try to make sure that nobody like that gets in office.
Because it's in no one's interest in that, I don't know if you like the word deep state, or all of the people involved in making money from the government, whatever that is. Yeah. They don't want them in there to shake the branches.
I like to call it the persistent bureaucracy, because they can wait out anybody who's elected who, Donald Trump toward the end of his presidency issued some executive orders that I followed up on one or two of them. Whatever happened, they were just simply ignored. I don't know if that's an act of treason. I don't know if it's illegal. I don't know if it's unconstitutional, but they, whoever they are, can just simply ignore something they don't like or stall, and they, in effect, can usurp a president.
Scary. Also, you talk about these other organizations, but these current ones are really monopolies. I mean, I love the Rumbles of the world and the True Socials, but the truth is it's very hard to usurp someone that has really monopolistic control. And that's what Google has and YouTube has right now. It's very hard to pull that aside. And now you're adding in artificial intelligence into that, which is going to dominate us in a way that we won't even be perceiving of that. And these companies are spending a lot of money right now to win that compute war. And it's got me definitely concerned.
Yeah, artificial intelligence is information control on steroids. There's one example in my book of a scientist who conducted some studies regarding hydroxychloroquine and its effectiveness during COVID, and then went through the exercise of asking an artificial intelligence model about the studies and kept getting documented, factually incorrect information one after the next about the studies and the status of what hydroxychloroquine studies showed. And every time he called the artificial intelligence on the false information, the AI would apologize and give him a slightly different answer, but not explain why it came up with the wrong information in the first place. And one stunning example was in one study that two studies the AI was trying to disparage about the positive aspects of hydroxychloroquine. It claimed the studies were very small and it cited like 112 test subjects in one and a couple hundred in another. In fact, it had over 10,000 test subjects in one of the ones it said had just very few. Those mistakes, seems to me, can only be made if someone is directing the artificial intelligence to the bad information. Ultimately, when the AI was then directed to its misinformation, it found the correct information, which is baffling. So it had access to it initially, but only when corrected did it find the truth. And I think about how many people will rely on this sort of thing, much like Google, as if it is the end-all and be-all. Well, I did an AI search or I did a Google search and this is what they said. So I think our main job is to make sure people are skeptical of what they hear and find out other ways to get information besides the monopolized sources so that they can reach truth. Now, skepticism in itself is a problem, because I reported some years ago on people inside who work for a living on trying to confuse people and shape information a certain way, and they said their job is accomplished if they simply do nothing more than confuse people. If you don't want people to know the truth and you end up confusing them enough that they don't believe anything, in some respects the mission is accomplished. And so I think a lot of people are on that end of the spectrum now. They don't believe anything, even when you tell them something that is true, because they don't know how to sort through the truth. And we're in this weird information age.
It's like a fifth generation psychological operation.
Right.
Yeah, AI is definitely of a concern. One of the things that we like about the blockchain is that with that you can at least kind of prove the provenance of the data that a conclusion was based on, and you can track it. You can also own your own AI agents so they won't be owned by a corporation. And that gives me a little bit of a ray of hope, where some of the stuff is also decentralized and the hardware is decentralized. But it does feel like very David and Goliath, but I'd rather do that than just in OpenAI we trust, or Microsoft we trust, or in Meta we trust, because I already know how that works in a Web 2 world, in a YouTube example, let alone the AI. And I was on a call the other day with like 100 kind of members, a very well accomplished group, and one of them did an AI search on something, and he just parroted it back to me as gospel. I think I mentioned I was on the Alex Jones show when I was in Austin. He said, "Oh, this is what they told me about Alex Jones." And I said, "Are you seriously trusting a Google synopsis about someone?" And this was a fairly intelligent person. And I thought, wow, people are really just outsourcing their brains, and this is going to happen more and more.
It's true. It's shocking that today people still do that. They'll point to Wikipedia, which I've reported on as such a managed resource in terms of information flow, and they'll point to Wikipedia still, knowing better, I would think, and cite something as if it's the truth on some controversy.
I think it comes down to maybe that confusion, lack of bandwidth, and most people are stressed about their own problems.
That's right.
They're in some type of a economic control prison cycle. They've got lots to deal with. They've got outside stressors, sometimes intentional, some not, and they just optimize.
Yeah,
and so they do that.
That's right.
Wikipedia is just the worst. So many people believe it's like legit, in fact. And I hear intelligent people saying, overall it's correct. But I've gone deep on Wikipedia, and I have people that don't like me because of the content we produced in 2020. They just don't like me for some reason. And their mission is to constantly rewrite and find ways to slander the Wikipedia. And I know it's co-opted just as bad, if not worse, than any kind of media outlet.
Yeah. I've documented that in great detail. And sometimes it's not just guys that don't like you. There are organized interests, PR firms, and crisis management firms that learned very early on that understood how any form of information that can be co-opted has been. The Wikipedia was going to be very powerful.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.